Hello, this is Rajesh Pillai, and in this episode we will build a dynamic form builder using React. The markup of the dynamic form builder is shown on the screen. So it can take couple of props like title, a model object, and the model object can contain certain attributes like key, label, and couple of additional props. Now these props can contain standard HTML attributes that can be directly embedded within the dynamic form. And we also have a onSubmit handler. So whenever the user clicks on the submit button on our dynamic prop or dynamic form, we can pass that information back to the parent component. Okay, so this is kind of a very small demo of what we can build using some of the cool features of ReactJS. So let's use the create React app to create our new project for this dynamic form builder. So I'll type in create React app and the name of the project. So I'll name this as dynamic form. Okay, so this is the name I am kind of giving to this project. Now it will take some time to get installed. Once the installation is done, cd into the dynamic form folder and do an npm start. So once the create React app is done, cd into the project that you just created and do an npm start. So when you do the npm start, your local server will be set up on port 3000 or any other port based on the availability, and then we can browse the application. So by default you will get the default React starter kit, and we will start modifying the code to make the dynamic form builder work. Once the local server starts up, browse on to localhost 3000, or in some cases it may directly open up and you will be presented with the welcome to React screen. Now we'll do some cleanup on this and then start working with the code. Now fire up your favorite editor and open this project. So I'll go back to my VS Code, click on open folder and browse to the place where I had actually created my project. In this case I had called it as dynamic form. I'll click on open or select folder and the project will be open for me. Okay, so once the project comes in out, I'll go to the index.js, and here we don't have to change anything, so let's go to app.js and let's remove this entire thing from here and save the file. We also don't need this logo. I'll remove the logo as well. So once I make these changes, you will see an empty screen coming up in here. Okay, this is where we will actually start putting our user interface for the dynamic form. Okay, so let's get coding. Go back to your VS Code, and the first thing that I need is some data to work with. So right within this app class, I'll create a state object and then put some hard-coded data. Okay, now this data is only for my reference purpose kind of, so that when we test out the submit button of the form, we can kind of push data into this object in here. Okay, so I have some information in here, so I don't need this profile for now, so I'll just remove it from here. I just need the bare minimum thing to test this application. Okay, so now I have the data with me. Now let's get and start building the code for the dynamic form. Now how do I want to structure the application, right? So that's one of the things that we have to think through whenever we are building a component. Now in this case I'll keep my component description very simple, and I'll kind of start with a dynamic form component, right? This form component is not yet there. We have to kind of code it out shortly. Okay, so this is the markup for the dynamic form. Now once I have the markup for the dynamic form, I need to kind of configure this dynamic form with the object model that I have to work with. So now in this case, say we are working with this set of data, right? So that essentially means when the dynamic form is rendered, we need to be presented with all these input screens, for example name, age, qualification and rating, so that the user can enter the data and submit back the information. Okay, that means we have to essentially give some props to this. Okay, so let's kind of begin with this. I can actually do a self-closing tag here because I won't be wrapping anything within the dynamic form here. Okay, I'll be giving a self-closing tag. Now the first thing I'll give it a title, right? So this is a prop for my dynamic form, so I'll call it as registration. Okay, so kind of, yeah, so when we create a dynamic form component, it is expecting certain props, right? In this case, title. Similarly, I'll also give a prop of a model. Okay, now this model will be a kind of array object, okay, that contains information about the form fields to be rendered. Okay, and then we have to define the model, right? So what elements you need in the form, right? So I may need to give a key here so that we have a unique field to identify. Then I will give it a label. So this is the text that is rendered on the form, and then I can pass in some props as well. So in this case I am indicating that I need to create a input field of with a label of name, and kind of this field is required, right? So I can pass in some props as well. Okay, I'll say this field is required. This is a simple definition or configuration to create a form element. Now in this case what we are expecting is our form will generate a label with a text name, and also it will generate an input by default with a type of text. Okay, so similarly I could continue with this and create couple of more fields, right? So I'll kind of take some already predefined configuration and put it here for our reference. This is the complete markup that is needed for our dynamic form to render name, age, ratings and qualification. Okay, so this is one thing that is already kind of done at this point. Now there should be a way to handle the submit button, right? That means I also will pass a on submit event handler as a prop. Okay, this is an event handler. So this will get the model, which is the actual data that is filled in the form, and whenever the submit button is clicked, we'll call an on submit method on our form. Okay, so this is the configuration that we are expecting. Now at this point in time, none of this thing is defined, right? We just kind of laid out the expectation about how this dynamic form will look like. Okay, so let's get coding and start building or implementing the dynamic form component. Okay, before getting into the code for the dynamic form, let's take a very quick look at this property. So this key field is required for our dynamic form, so that we have a unique key element. The labels are the descriptions that will be kind of printed onto the labels. Okay, now we can also give a type. So in this case, age is of type number, right? So I'll actually use the type props and pass in number. By default, if you don't give the type, the default will be a text. Okay, similarly you can also give some validations, right, in here. So any validations or any additional valid HTML attributes that you have to pass through your dynamic form, that has to be passed as a props in here. You can call it anything. In this case I actually said call it as props. So in this case we are saying the rating should be between 0 and 5. Okay, so this is what this the definition of this elements within this model indicates. Okay, now let's create the component itself. So the first thing I'll do for the component is go back to my source folder in here and right click and create a new folder called as components. Okay, and within this components I'll create a new folder called as dynamic form. Okay, this is how I will structure my code for the component. Within the dynamic form, I'll create a file called as index.js, which will house all the code for the dynamic form. And also I'll create one more file called say form.css, okay, which will contain all the styles for the form. Since styling is not the core part of this demonstration, I had already built some simple CSS to style our form, which I'll put in the form.css file. Okay, I still have certain things empty in here because I haven't decided how to style it, but let's take a very quick look at this. So we have a class with a dynamic form, we have a class with a dynamic form and form group, and that's the two important things that we need to be aware of. Okay, you can just refer the source code in here with respect to how these styles are working. Now once I have the styles in here, I'll go back to my dynamic form component class. Okay, this is where the entire thing will be lying in there, right? The first thing is I'll import React DOM and our form component. Okay, this is the base minimum thing that is required for me, right? Then I'll create a class for this component, which is export default class dynamic form and extends from react.component. Okay, this is the bare minimum thing that is needed to create a class. I'll also put in a constructor that takes the props. Okay, so whenever you have a constructor, right, you have to call the super and pass in the props to the parent. Now this dynamic form is a stateful form, right? So we have to have a state as well. But then at this point in time, I don't know what are the fields, right, that should be stored within the state. These fields will come from the definition that we are given within the model section here, right? So we have to create this state information dynamically. I hope this kind of thing is clear in there, right? So now this creates a markup. Now every form that we create or every component that we create will have a render method. So that's the next thing we have to do in here. We'll put a render method. Okay, and from the render method I'll simply return for now a div. Okay, this is the thing I am returning from a render method with a class name of, in case my parent component is passing some class name. In this case it is not, but in case it is passing, I'll just use this dot props dot class name. Okay, so now we have the basic structure of the form. Okay, so what do I mean by this, right? So if I go back to my app.js, maybe in here, okay, assume that this dynamic form you are passing in a class name as well, right? Maybe class name of the app. Okay, so we are saying, okay, when this form is being rendered, take this class name with the parent is passing to us, okay, and attach it to the class name of the div element that we are creating in here. Okay, so kind of a basic way to take in the prop that is being passed. Now since we already made a provision to pass in the class name, okay, let's make use of this. So instead of app, I'll call it as form, so that we can do some styling on this dynamic form from the external thing as well. And then I'll go to my app.css and put a simple class of form here, right? So in this case I'm just leaving a padding of 20 pixels. Okay, so we have the basic stuff ready for now. Okay, now let's get to the coding part. So the dynamic form takes a title, a model, okay, and model contains a lot of information which has to be dynamically created, and then on submit handler. Okay, so let's kind of use this information and build the basic stuff for our form, right? So I'll go back to the index.js in here, and right within the render method, the first thing I'll grab is the title. Okay, so I can grab the title by using this props.title. Now in case if the title is, say, no passed to the form, right, I'll pass in a default title of dynamic form. Okay, now actually I could have destructured this information also, but again, as that is not the primary criteria for this tutorial, I'm just using the simplest way in here. So once I have the title, I can go back to this return statement, and let's use this title within an h3. Okay, so at this point in time, if I save this information and go back to the browser, okay, so in this case you are getting the error that dynamic form is not defined. Okay, let's check what we are missing in there. Now if I look at my code in here, so we have a dynamic form class here. Okay, if I go back to my app.js, we haven't imported it yet here, right? So that's the first thing we have to import whenever we use any component. So I'll come back in here and say import dynamic form from components / dynamic form. Now here we don't have to give the index.js file, because by default it will be kind of taken. Okay, so let's check why this error is still coming out in here. So import dynamic form from component / dynamic form. Actually there was no error, my editor just went mad at me, I guess. So once I import the dynamic form in here, and then if I go back to the browser, you will see the registration title being printed on there. This is what we did with this specific line of code in here, right? So now we are able to render the title. but then we need to kind of render the entire form, right? So after the title is rendered in here, I'll kind of create a new form element. Okay, and now we can pass in some information. So I'll give it a class name. Okay, this CSS is already created, right? So I'll call it as dynamic form. Okay, and then whenever the form is submitted, okay, so that means we will handle the on submit event handler. Okay, so I'll call this dot on submit, which we have to implement, okay, and pass in E as a parameter. So now we just created the markup for our form and also attached an event handler called on submit. Okay, now after this the actual form has to be rendered, right? So we will do that shortly, but then let's also put in a submit button. So I'll say div class name is equal to form group. Okay, and here I'll say button of type submit, okay, with the text of submit and button. Okay, so now we have the basic stuff ready. Now except this actual element being rendered, we have the markup for the bare minimum stuff, right? So at this point in time, if I go back to the browser, you will see a submit button. If I click on the submit button, nothing will happen because we haven't yet handled the code. Okay, let's first fix this submit thing in here. So let's go back to our class here, and just above or between this constructor, let's put our on submit method. Now what we are saying here is, so whenever the submit happens, call the on submit method, right? And here we are preventing the default action. So if you observe, right, by default when you do a submit, a full refresh of the page will happen. So this will prevent that full refresh. Now what do we want to do, right? So whenever this form is rendered and the submit button is clicked, we have to call the parent and indicate that the form has been changed, right? So if you look at the app.js, we already have a submit handler here, right, which we haven't yet implemented in here. Okay, but then let's connect these two things for now and see how this works. So I'll come back to this on submit handler, and I'll say if this dot props dot on submit. So if the parent is passing in the on submit handler, then call that method, okay, and pass in this dot state, okay, whatever information is in the state. So at this point in time nothing will be there, right? But then we should be able to communicate from child to the parent. Okay, let's complete this by implementing the submit handler on the parent as well. So I'll copy this on submit handler and go back to app.js code, right? So here we have to implement an on submit handler, which will get a model, right? Okay, I'll just go above this render method and put in my method here, and no need for prevent default because this was already done. We'll get a model from here. So at this point in time this will be empty, but just to ensure that we are able to call this method, I'll put an alert say hi. Okay, and once I save this information, I can go back to my browser and click on submit, and you get the message I. Okay, that means you can actually call the method on the parent from the child. Now here actually I'm not using the prop types and things like that, okay, just to keep this demonstration small. But in real case you will start implementing all the prop types and the required functions and properties. Okay, so now is the time to actually create the form. So let's go back to the code, go to the index.js within the dynamic form component, and right below the form, this is where we have to create all the input components, right? So we have to create all these input components in there. Okay, so in this case input of text, input of numbers, and things like that. So now I could write the code in here, but then to keep my code manageable, I'll create a helper method that will be rendering this form. Okay, so we have to implement this method. I'll call this method as render form. Okay, so I have the render form method, right? So I'll come back to my class here and implement the render form method. Okay, so this is where the code for the render form will go. The render form is the heart of this method. So what is the responsibility of the render form method, right? So the render form should loop through all the model element in here and then start creating the labels and the input boxes. So that's what the render form will do. Okay, we will use this key attribute here, or key props here, to assign unique key to every element that we create, right? So that React can do some internal optimization. So I'll go back to the render form, and the first thing I'll do is grab the model, right? So I can grab the model by using this dot props dot model. Okay, this will get me the model that we are passing in from here. This is an array, right? So once I hold on to the model, I'll create a loop by using the map method, right? So I can say model dot map, okay, get every model, okay, and let's write some code within this map method that will give us the correct UI for all the elements, right? So map method is kind of very handy in here, right? So what is map, right? So map will take every element in this model and then kind of return back some transformed object, right? This can be an object. So in this case, we will create divs and inputs for our forms. Okay, so let's grab some properties from the props. So I'll get the key, which is nothing but m dot key. I'll grab the type, which is m dot type. Okay, I'll grab the props, which is m dot props. In case the props is not there, I'll just pass an empty object literal. Okay, similarly I can do it for the type as well. Okay, so once I have this information, I will return a transformed object in this return statement. Okay, that's where this form UI will be built. Okay, so what do we want to return? So I need to return a div, okay, that will be containing our inputs and labels. Now this div, I'll give it a key. Okay, so I can give a key like we already have the key, right? I'll directly use the key here, which is we are grabbing from this variable in here. So once I get the key, I'll also give it a class name. So we already have the CSS class created for this. This class name is called form group. Okay, and then within this we have to create a label for every model that we have, right? And similarly we also have to create an input. So I'll create a label, okay, with a class name of form label. Okay, and then I'll also assign a key so that we have some unique value. Now I'll randomly create some key, right? So I'll start, this is a label, right? I'll say the key should start with L, just for my reference, and then the actual key. Okay, and then we'll use the HTML for, okay, which is kind of a best practice when we use a label, and I'll use m dot key as the value for the HTML for element here, right? So once I have this definition ready, I'll close on this tag, okay, and close on the label tag. Okay, now right within this tag we will be rendering our label, right? So I could open a curly bracket and say m dot label. Okay, so this piece of code will create label for every element in my model. Now we have to create input elements as well, right? But hold on for a moment, right? So the thing that I'll do here is the render form should return this form UI. Okay, so that's what I will be doing in here. Okay, so let's see the output of this. Okay, so if I go to the browser now, you will see all the labels getting rendered correctly, right? So this form UI map code looped through all the models and then printed out the label in here. Now similarly we have to render the input also, right? So let's go back to the code and have a look at the definition. So for rendering the input, so in case the type is there, we will create an input of that specific type. Okay, in case the type is not there, we will create an input of type text. Okay, so one thing I can do here is, so in the type here, right, so in case the type is not there, I'll give it a default value of text, okay, so that we can render a text input. Now to create the input for every element, I'll create an input tag. Okay, and maybe I can close this here and we'll put some props. Now what I'll be doing here is, see, so if you look at the definition, right, so in certain input you will see there's a props attribute, right? So if you have a props attribute, we have to pass that props attribute back to our input element here, right? So here I'll say spread out the entire props, right? That means copy all the props from the props object that we are passing in here and spread that onto the input object that we are creating. Okay, so this is a spread operator, and then we'll give it a reference so that we can access this input in our code. Okay, so this is a ref, so this will have the key as a parameter. Okay, now the thing here is, see, now we have to create the state for each of these keys dynamically, right? So we need to have a state with the key property of name, age, rating and qualification. Okay, so what we can do here is, when we create a key, so that we can uniquely identify this input, I will use this and create the key dynamically. So this m.key could be name, id, whatever thing you are passing in from here, right? This will be unique, so that I will be using as a key in my state. So I'm using this m.key is equal to key. Okay, so this will kind of create a reference to every input element that I am creating in there, so that I can later on access that using this dot name, this dot age, this dot rating and this dot qualification. Okay, that's what this ref gives me here. The next thing I'll do here is to attach a class name. So this I'll call it as form input. Okay, then we have to attach a type, right? Remember, type input can be of text, number, right? So we already have a variable called type. I'll put that variable in here. Okay, then I'll give in the key. Okay, now to make, see, the m.key we are already using here, right? As a key attribute here, right? But we prefix with an L here, right? So that we have a unique key. Similarly, for the input, I'll just prefix I as an input and then put in the m.key just to make it unique key. Okay, so I am almost done with this input, right? So if I save this file and go back to my browser, you will see all the inputs are correctly rendered. See, so this is text input, this is a numeric input, right? I can change the value in here. Okay, now the next thing that we have to do is, whenever this input changes, right, we have to grab the key and create the respective state, so that when the form submit happen, we can pass that state back to the parent element. Okay, let's do that now. Before we attach the onChange handler, let's have a look at the React developer tool. So once you open up the browser and bring in the developer tool, go to the React section in here. Now if you look at the markup that is created, right, so you have a dynamic form with a div with a class name of form. Then for every element that you have, you also have a key element in here, right? So these keys are being given in there. Okay, so this is what you can get in. So this is the purpose of the key that we created. Okay, now let's get on with attaching the onChange handler to the input element. Okay, now let's attach the onChange handler to the input element. So I'll come back to my index.js file within the dynamic form component and attach the onChange event handler. Okay, so this takes in a parameter event, and once I grab the event, I'll call the onChange method on this class, passing in the event as well as the key, because we have to create the state information using this key dynamically, right, which we are already getting in here. Okay, and I don't want this prefix when I create the key. I actually want the name, which is name, age, rating and qualification. Okay, so that's why I'm passing in the key. So once I get this information, I'll come to my class and create a onChange event handler that has the event as well as the key. Okay, now we have to create, we have to put this information, whatever the user is entering, into the respective state object, right? So I can use this dot set state. Okay, so when you use a set state, we need key, right? Now here the key is dynamic, right? So create dynamic key, I can wrap the key in square bracket. Okay, and once I create the key, I can get the value of the key by using this and then pass the value in here within this array notation, because this key, this array of key will give me the actual input element, right? To get the value, I'll use dot value. Okay, this will get me the value of the respective. So if it is name, this will get the value of name. Okay, if it is qualification, this line will get the value of the qualification and then attach it to a respective key in my state. Okay, so once I kind of put this code in here, and we already have the submit handler here, right? So we are calling this dot state we are calling the onSubmit method on the parent and passing in the state. Now if I go back to app.js, right, we already have the submit here. So here I could at this point write in JSON dot stringify and let's see what is this model object that we are getting from the dynamic form, right? So once I make this change, go back to my browser, I'll do some data entry here, say Rajesh Pillai, say age is maybe 40, the rating is say 3, say qualification is say graduate, right? Now once I click on submit, see, we're actually passing all the information that the user has entered into the parent form, right? So we are able to pass information from parent to child. Now we are almost done with this dynamic form, right? I can actually kind of use this validation. So if this was name was required, right? Because if I look at the markup here in app.js, you will see the name prop is required, right? Which we are taking into account. Now if I go back in here and remove the name and do a submit, you'll see automatically the HTML5 validations comes out in here, right? Now just to complete this demo, let's log the state information so that when we click on submit, we can see the actual state information being rendered somewhere here, right? Just as a JSON object. Now we are on the final part of this demonstration, just to complete this, right? So once we do a submit, let's kind of take this data and add back to the state so that we can say we are done with this CRUD operation, right? At least the create part of the CRUD operation. So once I get this information, I can say this dot set state, and let's update the state here, and the model that we are adding, I need to be added as a first element, right? And then spread out the entire existing state data. Okay, now once the state is rendered, now in real projects you could actually kind of in the render method loop through this and create a table or create a form, right? But for this I'll just update the state and then come back in my render method of the app.js, and I'll put in a pre tag so that we can output the JSON just as a string, just to verify it. Okay, but feel free to render a table or a list, whatever you feel comfortable here. Okay, so once I save this information and come back to the project, okay, and now if I one more thing I'll do before I go back in here. So if you look at the data, right, we have an ID, right, and now we are not passing in the ID because ID has to be generated from the server, right, or maybe using some other logic. So in this case, just for the sake of completion, what I'll be doing in here is once I get the model, I just create a hard-coded ID here by using the numeric value from the date. Okay, so what will happen with this is here we will get a new ID which is nothing but the numeric value of that current date at this point in time, so that we have a unique value as part of this data set. Okay, so once this information is done, I'll save this and go back to the browser and just refresh to ensure nothing is wrong in here. We can see the existing data. I'll create a new data here, say Rajesh Pillai, some age I'll put in there, say I'll put a rating and say a qualification, and when I click on submit, you will see the alert as well as the data will be added to the JSON that we are displayed here, right? So we see the data is getting correctly logged in. Okay, so this is what dynamic forms are and how to create a very simple dynamic form using React. And this is just kind of the start of this, right? Now you can take this concept, extend it, add more types to it, render other types of UI elements as well. Okay, I hope you like this short episode, and in case you liked it, please like it, share it, and do comment, give your feedback. In case you didn't like any part of this episode, again please give some constructive criticism so that I can improve future videos. Okay, thank you very much. Have a nice day coding React.